Hello and welcome to Conversations in Depth, a service of QRCA Views magazine. I'm your host, Mike Carlon, and today it's my pleasure to introduce you to Laura Nozica, who's going to talk to us about how and why she started her podcast, Desperate for a Diagnosis. Before I do, though, I just wanted to share why we were so eager to cover podcasting on a podcast. And I promise you, it's not just to be meta. It's actually an interesting area of interest for me. I started my own podcast back in 2011. I can't believe it's been that long since I started Uncorking a Story, but lo and behold, it has. I haven't gotten any older, though. And that was around the time when I was just breaking out of working for an agency and going out on my own as an independent moderator for the first time anyway. And I thought it would be a great way, having a podcast would be a great way to showcase my moderating skills to prospective clients. They always seem to want a tape. They always used to say, and maybe some of you remember this, I'm sure some of you remember this, hey, can I see a tape of your work? I mean, how many VHS tapes do you have in your basement of old work? I still have a bunch in a box, and my wife keeps saying, hey, Mike, do you want all these tapes? Now, look, I don't have anything to play them on anymore. But yeah, I want those tapes. You never know. I mean, those are collector's items. They might wind up in the Mike Carlon Museum someday. I don't know. But anyway, we did get tapes back in those days. And it's funny. I mean, DVDs were a thing in 2011. But I digress. We had tapes. And, you just can't give a tape of the work you're doing from one client to another. I don't know why clients would even think that was something that would be even remotely acceptable, because I know my Pepsi client wouldn't want my Unilever client to see what I was doing for them. So I had this podcast. I started this podcast, and I would say, hey, you want to hear an example of me interviewing somebody? Listen to this episode. And it worked. It worked out pretty well for me. I was able to reduce my clients' concerns, because that's what it's all about. It's all about reducing their fear that they're making a bad decision by going with you. And the podcast served its purpose well. And then it didn't serve its purpose well at all, because I didn't need to do that anymore. I didn't need to show examples of my work. I had a reputation. I had positive word of mouth, as they say in the biz. So I needed to pivot the podcast. That's when I started to interview authors, because that's another passion area of mine is writing. So Uncorking a Story is now still appropriately named to feature conversations with best-selling authors. But I wanted to find somebody in our industry who had a similar path to mine and pick her brain a little bit on her journey into podcasting, because I'm fascinated by this. I maybe you're the same as me. I don't know. You might think to yourself, gosh, if I didn't moderate anymore, what could I do? How could I use these skills? Of course, you could facilitate meetings, brainstorming sessions, things like that. But I still love interviewing people. So podcasting for me, hey, look, if I could make a living podcasting, I would. But I can't just yet. Someday I think that'll happen. But I wanted to talk to another moderator who felt the same way as me, dig into her journey, how she started, all that good stuff, so we could teach you, fine members of the QRCA, who may want to start your own podcast, what you're about to get into. So without any further ado, let's talk to Laura Nozica. Laura Nozica is a moderator from Chicago who has a long career in healthcare, which drives her passion to elevate the healthcare experience. Out of Laura's own experience of spinning through the healthcare revolving door, desperately trying to find a diagnosis for symptoms that made no sense to most doctors or were simply dismissed, she created the Desperate for a Diagnosis podcast. But that's not the full story, and we're going to get that from her momentarily. Laura is a market researcher and moderator focusing on helping healthcare organizations and pharmaceutical companies better understand their patient perspective. Welcome to Conversations in Depth, Laura Nozica.
Well, thank you, Mr. Carlon. That is probably the most creative introduction that I've ever had. So thank you for that. That was lovely. Nice to see you.
Well, I'm going to say that it's nice to see you, and I'm going to say the cliched thing, which is, hey, you said Mr. Carlon, I got to look around and see if my dad's here.
Hey, yo, hey.
Did I do a good job sounding like I was remotely from Chicago? That was more of a New York accent, I think.
A little bit. Well, there's a little overlap there. And over here, you're either from the north side or the south side. So over by there. So
you're over by there.
It's close. Yeah.
It's close. Well, I mean, we could talk pleasantries all day, Laura, but I'm curious, where does your journey as a podcaster begin?
Well, actually, I need to blame it all on you, Michael.
Oh, well, I will take none of this credit or none of this blame.
You are
Let me rephrase that. I will take all of the credit, but none of the blame.
you are my podcaster mentor. Did you know that?
Well, I'm learning something new every day, and I just learned that. But tell me a little bit more about that. Tell me
Yeah.
how great I am.
How great you are. Well, talk about talking pleasantries all day long, Michael. We can do that. But it's up to you if you want me to boost your ego or if you want me to answer your question, Mr. Moderator Man. You tell me.
Well, as a good moderator, I'll make this less about me, even though I want to, and make it more about you. So let's start with your journey, Laura.
Well, and that's exactly what I set out to do with the podcast is to not make it about me, but about patients. As you said, I am a moderator for a living and mainly in healthcare, and so I have interviewed. I don't even know how many hundreds anymore, patients and physicians, but it's the patient stories that really touched me. And oftentimes I don't always get to ask the questions that I would like to ask and things that I'm really curious about and those things that I really want to dig into. And so I thought I just have to produce my own podcast so I can hear the stories and ask the questions that I want to ask because it's certainly not unusual for me to hear from patients talking about how their symptoms were dismissed by physicians and how doctors might have said, oh, it's all in your head, your tests are inconclusive, but still these patients just feel horrible and took them a really long time to get a diagnosis, and some are even still looking. And so I wanted to dive into that more, assuming that there's more than one person out there that needs a question answered, and maybe podcast guests could help other folks. So that's why I started the podcast.
Yeah, I get it. And I think moderators, most of us anyway, are highly empathetic individuals. Meaning like when we're talking to people, like we can't help but make connections with other people. And especially in healthcare, you're hearing these stories and oftentimes, they're very sad and it's like the empath in us wants to jump in and like give these people a hug sometimes, I think.
It's
And we just
true.
want to let them know that they're being heard. Of course, if we get too touchy feely, those people in the back room or the virtual back room are going to be like, "Hey, can you get to the next section of the discussion guide?" And maybe not have the therapy session that you're you're going down
Yeah.
in the room. So it sounds like part of Desperate for a Diagnosis, part of the genesis of it is not just to indulge that within you, though, to give yourself an ability to make this connection with other people, but to really have it serve as a tool for other patients who might be going through this, so they don't feel so alone. Do I understand that correctly?
You got it. You got it, Mike. Yeah, because I'm always more curious about these people than I'm given time for in an interview. And certainly, as you know, we have objectives that we need to fill. There's a reason that this market research is being conducted, but I wanted to go beyond the market research and those objectives to allow patients to really tell their stories. And they want to tell their stories and they want to help. They want to help other people find treatments and diagnosis and just let other patients know that they're not the only ones who are having this difficulty in this journey, as I refer to as the healthcare revolving door for a lot of people. And so that curiosity that we moderators tend to have, be it healthcare or ice cream products or cable or financial services, whatever it might be, we still are always looking for more. So I wanted to give an opportunity to patients to tell their story, help others, but it's also certainly is not a one-sided podcast from the patient perspective. I certainly have had opportunity to interview physicians as well, and that'll be the goal for 2024 to have some other healthcare professionals on to talk about their perspectives. As I like to say, I like to cover off both sides of the bedside.
Oh, that sounds nice. Both sides of the bedside. And it sounds like you might have a nice bedside manner, Laura. I'm just going to point that out.
I do try, but that's what we moderators do to make sure that we make people comfortable right off the bat and build rapport in a really short amount of time. And so there are some patients that have really stuck with me from a moderator standpoint, but certainly through the podcast that I started back in May, and these stories have really stuck with me. And there have been patients that I've actually thought about months after I had interviewed them because their stories were so powerful and unfortunately sad. And it's hard to shake that off, but some of them really, really stick with me.
So you mentioned starting the podcast back in May. Is that when you first had the idea for the podcast, or what's the lead up time getting to May? In other words, when did you first have this idea, hey, I want to start a podcast, to when did you actually launch?
Well, since you're my podcast Yoda, Mike, I think you know that you and I talked about this, I think back in the fall of last year of 2022. And I had also run the idea by some other research colleagues, and many of them thought that there was certainly a place for this type of podcast to further the research, if you will, but really just to further my own curiosity about this patient journey, because healthcare in this country really is a problem, and patients do have a hard time navigating and getting what they need, and it's incredibly frustrating. So I did want to bring home that you're, whoever you are, you're not the only one who's experiencing this type of journey.
Now, I think about like all the moderators I know. I know a couple, one or two. And
Two
we all have this like similar skill set, right? Where we're really good at talking to people. And it seems like, getting into podcasting is is a natural extension of what it is we do for a living to make money, feed our families, and afford whatever lifestyles it is we have. Um, and so like this, there's a big skill overlap though, and I'm imagining also that there are some other people listening to this who might say to themselves, "Hey, I could do that." It's like the same people who say, "Hey, I can write a book. I know how to write. I can put words together." So I'm curious, what challenges did you face? And this would be some edification, for those sort of aspiring QRCA podcasters out there. What are some lessons you learned while starting your show that you could share with the fine people who are listening to this conversation right now?
Mhm. Well, it certainly doesn't come without challenges. And I think once I started getting into it, I did question several times, do I really want to do this? Do I really want to do this? From the standpoint of everyone thinks that you can just get a microphone, plug it in, and you're ready to go. And I can certainly say that all microphones don't always work either, as we did our tech check here today. And so it really, being a researcher, I did a lot of research. I probably over researched and probably overthought the whole thing. And at some point in time, I just said, you just got to go and build it while you fly. So it'll never be 100% fully baked. It has evolved even since May, but certainly from learning what equipment, what platform to use, trying to understand the cost behind all of it. So there's the cost of the equipment, there's the cost of all these platforms, and it's not just, say, whether you decide to use Zoom or Squadcast or Riverside or any of those other ones. I did a lot of research into that. There's the editing, and so then that's, I think, where people get really challenged by, I've got all these recordings, now what do I do with it? And so that was a whole nother learning curve of 2 a.m. nights trying to get it right and figure it out. And some things had to be re-recorded. And how do you record an intro and an outro? And then how do you mash all that together? And how do you produce the video versus the audio? And it really was a high learning curve, and I'm still learning, and it's not perfect. And like I said, it's evolving, and even down to things like podcast cover artwork and how to get it on all the platforms. So, and I don't even know all the lingo, but I just did it because it was either, shut it down completely or just go. So I just decided to just go. And then of course there's trying to find people to be guests on the podcast. So that there's that whole other level of effort and production.
I mean, so it's not, in other words, it's not just a plug and play thing. It's not like you're going to get go to the store, go to Best Buy, get a USB microphone and and then just plug it in and then start interviewing people. There's a lot to consider. There's pre-production, there's production, there's post-production. I think what's going to scare most people, honestly, is post-production. That notion of, hey, I've got these interviews recorded now. How do I do that intro? How do I do that outro? Do I even plan for commercial breaks if I want to monetize this somehow commercially? What happens when the audio levels between my guest and myself are different? I mean, there's nothing more annoying than listening to a podcast where you can hear the host really clearly, but the guest seems like they're, a mile away.
Right.
And then, especially if you're like me and you listen to your podcast when you're running, it's like, or you're exercising or in your car, you're constantly fiddling with the volume to try and hear what's being said. So there is a lot to consider when putting together a podcast, especially if you want to attract a sizable audience to make your show worth it. And by worth it, I mean to make sure that you're getting the exposure to the people you want to get the exposure to, as well as building that audience. So again, if you do want to monetize it someday, you've got to do that with, a sizable number of people.
Yeah.
So it's not just, there was a lot, in other words, there's a lot of learning by doing.
That there is, and there should be zero expectation to make a penny. You'll be spending pennies and hundreds of dollars initially. I hate to say it, depending on what kind of equipment you get, what platforms you subscribe to. Everything's an app and a monthly subscription or annual subscription, etc. And so there is certainly some level of commitment to it all. At this point, I have no expectations again of monetizing anything. It's really a matter of getting the stories out there and certainly having potential clients see Laura in action. And because that, those interviews are owned by the client. I don't own those. And so those certainly aren't opportunities for me to show my skill and my style, etc. So it's certainly secondary to getting out the story. But there's again, there's no expectation about making money. Even my mother will say, so you're going to make money at this? And I said, no, Mom, this is really more of it can be an expensive hobby if that's how you look at it. But this for me is more of a calling and kind of a passion project, and wherever it goes, it goes. I don't put a ton of pressure on myself, but I do have a goal to produce and push out a podcast once a week. There have been a few lulls just because I got really busy with work. Thank goodness. But I got really busy with work and some personal things. And sometimes I can't get one out a week. And of course, you need to have that churn of finding guests and mining for guests that also fill the mission of your podcast. So there's that as well. So there are a lot of components to putting it all together in that 1 hour, that 50 minutes, or however long it's going to be, even if it's 20 minutes. And there's so many other aspects to producing the show and different angles, which actually I enjoy doing. So I'm still willing to keep pushing and exploring these other aspects of podcasting.
So I do want to just go back to a few things you said. And I think one of the things you said was really important, which is, hey, don't necessarily go into this thinking you're going to make a ton of money doing it. Totally. I tell the same thing to authors, right?
Yeah.
Don't write a book thinking you're going to get rich, because that just will not happen. That is like one out of a million authors are going to like really make a decent living by writing books for a living. Most of us cannot afford our lives and lifestyles just by writing books. Same thing I think is true for podcasters. So don't go into it thinking, okay, this is going to help me replace my moderating income,
Right.
because that's not going to happen.
Exactly.
I don't want to bring anyone down here, but just to have it as a passion project and to do it for, to follow your own interest, to help other people, I think is a valiant and sort of selfless way to think about it. It's almost a way of giving back to other people, and I think that's reason enough to do a show like the show you do. But I do want to challenge you on something, because I know the first video you put out, and I know you posted about your first episode on LinkedIn, you put it up on YouTube. You actually did wind up getting some good numbers on your very first episode. And I know it was sort of a very, it was a very emotional episode. It was somebody that we both know in the market research industry.
Yep.
Oh, I think we met at a Quirks conference, if I'm not
Yeah.
mistaken, at Quirks in Chicago. But I mean, tell me, can you just share like what like that first episode did numbers wise?
Yeah. So, just from a YouTube perspective, I think that first episode, I think at this point, again, that was in May, I think there's about 1,200 views on that one. And it just, it blew me away. Now, I don't know if that was beginner's luck or what, but that's just the thing. Not all of them will reap the same amount of interest or views or downloads or listens, et cetera. And that's a whole other thing too. There's this whole level of analytics that's available, and you can either take it super seriously or take it with a grain of salt, whatever. Just the fact that it got so much traction, and certainly the topic was, yes, very emotional. And my first guest is highly well known and loved in the market research arena. And so, that certainly worked to my advantage. But it was such an important story and because I felt what he had to say and was so passionate about it, because it was in reference to his son in really a life or death situation that he was in. And I wanted to help him get that story out. And so that just was a catalyst to keep going, to think, well, who else can I help? What's the next thing? And so depends on what really drives you. So for me, it was, okay, what else is out there? Who else has a story? Who else has advice to give to other people who are in a healthcare situation? And then I started exploring, talking with healthcare professionals. I think you and I have both interviewed the same neurosurgeon. I had a gastroenterologist, gone menopause specialist. I have yet to produce their podcasts, and that's going to go out the door sometime next week. But it just is kind of this, I just kind of get really excited about, well, who else can I talk to? And again, I think for moderators, that's just something that's in us. How much more digging can we do? What's that little nugget that could help someone? Or, from a standpoint of our clients, we think, well, what's that one thing that a respondent might say that could drive a whole new solution at the same time? So again, where this goes for me, Mike, I'm not really sure, but it's certainly something that I have a lot of passion for, to keep putting out and evolving and just getting better.
Well, I mean, again, not to make this all about numbers, but you mentioned 1,200 views on YouTube. I just want to put that in perspective. For a brand new channel, for a first episode, for an hour plus long interview, 1,200 views is pretty amazing. So I think that's something you should be very proud of. And that starts getting you some subscribers. And, unfortunately on YouTube, you need at least 1,000 subscribers and X amount of hours of viewing every month to make a little, a little cash from YouTube. But you're on your way to doing that. And the other thing I'll say is, right now you're still very early in the game as far as, podcasting goes. So you may not know where it's going, but I think about it And if I were, if I didn't have a show and I'm thinking about putting a show together, I'd think about it this way too, which is, this show that you have, this asset is just that. It's one other asset in your arsenal. So a client, coming to you might see a clip of something you did on LinkedIn or on YouTube.
Uh-huh.
And they might say, hey, you know what? I'd like to maybe consider, getting a bid from this person. Now that may not have happened yet, but you're still very early on in the game for that. It's also a tool you can use for your own personal marketing. When you're doing your outreach, when you're doing your prospecting, to be able to say, hey, I'm Laura Nozica. I am a healthcare moderator, among other things. Here is kind of here's my pitch to you. And then, hey, if you want to know more, check out my YouTube channel, Desperate for a Diagnosis. And it's just something else. And if somebody's trying to decide between you and someone else, hey, this person's a known commodity. I've seen their work. That's how I started my show back in 2011. I had, when I first went out on my own after leaving an agency, I had clients or prospective clients say, hey, look, you sound good on paper, but we'd like to see an example of your work. So send me a tape. And I was joking before, before this call that, hey, we used to have tapes, there were VHS tapes.
Right.
But you can't just do that. Right. And you mentioned it before, you can't just share work you did for, one client to work you did with another. So I started sending people to the podcast, and for me, that worked. Now there were fewer podcasts in 2011 than there are in 2023, but I do think the technique works as well. And now with a lot of AI out there that helps us with finding video clips and putting together our shorts, as they call them in the biz, in the industry, on the socials, as the kids say. It is, our marketing can only get better and better from there.
Yeah. It definitely is, like you said, it's not just a plug and play by any means, but there have been plenty of times where clients have said, do you have anything that you could show me in terms of you in action, etc.? And I think the only videos I have are of the capstone class or capstone, I don't even know how to explain it, capstone exercise, if you will, of moderating a focus group when I went to Burke Institute, which is where I took 2 rounds of moderator training, and then you fly, and you've got 55 minutes with a group that they recruited on whatever topic you elected to create your guide around, etc. And you go. And so they videoed that, and then that was used as your critique, etc. But that's really all I have. And now, since I'm out of Burke, I don't know, 7-8 years now, those are a little old. Even they look a little fuzzy at this point too. Older production techniques back then, and it's just nice to be able to say, well, I have a podcast. And what's been great about it too is that it's been a conversation starter. I kind of like to put it on the level of, like, my other hobby, as you know, is ballroom dance. And so I could talk about when I wasn't working for myself, when I was in corporate America, and I'd be at some networking thing, and I would say, oh, I'm Laura Nozica. I work for XYZ healthcare system, or whatever healthcare organization I was working for. Oh, and something I do for fun is ballroom dance. I got everyone's attention on ballroom dance. No one really cared what I did for a living. So now when I say I have a podcast, I get, people kind of stop and say, and tell me more. They're moderating me because they want to learn more. So it's just been interesting. Or people who have maybe never engaged in any of my posts about the podcast, whether it's been on LinkedIn or Facebook, etc. They've come out right out and said, oh, I see you have a podcast. So it's kind of interesting on who's watching you, but you may not know. So,
well, I think the only logical next step for you is to create a podcast on ballroom dancing. Because I think that would be money, as Vince Vaughn would say in Swingers. That would be money. A podcast, and it's an audio only podcast, so you don't see anybody dancing. It's just two people describing dancing
And it's
on the podcast, like an audio story about people ballroom dancing.
well, and there are stories, and there's plenty of drama, and it's definitely a real thing. But it has been nice in terms of meeting new clients, because if you are able to get out to the conferences, it's great. But some of us independents at times don't always have the budget to get out there and shake hands, rub elbows, however you like to reference that. But it's nice to be able then to it's nice.
Wine and dine.
That's right. That's right. It's nice to be able to then kind of, again, show who you are in action. It's not just some Zoom meeting. You've got that as kind of one more tool in the toolkit, as you said, in terms of marketing.
I want to go back to your days pre-podcast, because I think the podcast is just one example of how innovative you are as a thinker, and I've always considered you to be like a hustler, because you're always thinking of
Well, thank you.
different angles for things. And I mean hustler in a good way, not in like
There's a time and
Larry
place for everything, Mike. Come on.
Oh boy. So, but I mean, can you give a little backstory as to how you fell into in the first place? Because you didn't come out of, Riva or Burke as a, 20, 30-year-old, et cetera. Moderating wasn't necessarily your intended career path. So would you share with the audience just how you came into the qualitative field?
Well, first of all, who's to say I'm still not 20 or 30? Come on, Michael.
I mean, you look like you're maybe 24.
Oh,
I've been told I need glasses, but you look maybe 24.
nice backing it up there, Mike. Nice backing it up. Nice try. Anyway, well, thank you for asking that, because I'm told that it's a unique story. I don't really know why, but I've had other market research folks say, how did you get from where you were to moderating? I don't think it's that much of a leap, but for others, it seems to be. So I've spent a lot of my career in healthcare. Early on, I was in hospitality. I was in sales and marketing for restaurants and hotels. And the industry can be a little wobbly. And in my 20s, I did jump over to healthcare sales, and then worked for a lot of the healthcare systems here in Chicago and in a marketing capacity, and worked for other companies, health related companies. I worked in patient recruitment for clinical trials. So it was all in a marketing, like I said, marketing capacity, but every job required the commissioning of market research. So it certainly wasn't unusual for me. But the first time I learned about qualitative was the first healthcare marketing job I ever had. Again, with one of the healthcare systems here in Chicago. And I saw this moderator navigating this conversation at a facility, but navigating this conversation with cancer patients. And I'd never seen anything like that before. And I thought, how does this happen, that there's this room full of people, patients, as we would refer to them in that context, patients, cancer patients, no less, who have had a variety of different cancers. There's 8 cancer patients in a room. And here's this stranger navigating this conversation. And of course, there's a business objective behind it. But I thought, if that's a real job, I want to do that one day. And I was just so fascinated by the fact that one person can build a rapport so quickly with people, again, for the purposes of a business objective, to understand their journeys, to make their lives better, easier, et cetera. I think the objective was to understand why cancer patients would travel to find a surgeon, but they were willing to get chemotherapy and radiation close to home. And I don't know, at the time, not knowing much about qualitative, it just blew my mind that you could actually talk to people in a room, strangers, learn about their journeys and make your business better, stronger, more meaningful, etc. And yes, of course, the goal is to grow business, but in a way, at least from a healthcare standpoint, is helping people. And so that's how I started learning about qualitative. And after that, every job, marketing job I ever had, there was some aspect of commissioning qualitative research in a variety of different ways. So it was just something that I felt from the standpoint of between my personality, my curiosity about people in general. I'd rather, this is awkward for me because you're asking me the questions because I don't really enjoy talking about myself that much, but I'd rather learn about other people and learn about them. But yeah, that's how I learned about what even qualitative was. And over time, I would talk to the moderators and say, "So how did you get into this?" And they would tell me about their own journeys and what it took to be a moderator. And I heard everything from you really need to be a marketer. People who are marketers do really well in moderating because then you understand the next step. What's the strategy behind what's happening next? Others have more of a of a background in research, something maybe more scientific, if you will, or psychology, much like yourself, but you also have a marketing background too. So that's you just never know where you're going to fall in life, and that's kind of how I look at the podcast. I don't know where it'll go. It could lead to something, could lead to nothing out of nothing but self satisfaction that I felt like I was doing something, but yeah, so it's funny how I moved into moderating, and when I decided that leaving corporate America made sense, that's what I did and started networking. And luckily, after networking for about a month, I had my first project moderating a project on idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, and
Oh,
I
now
talked to
stop with that sexy talk.
I know,
Uh,
I know, yeah,
but as we wrap up here, Laura, I want you to do something for me,
sure.
which is, can we bridge your original career path of sort of hospitality and life as a qualitative professional? Where do you see the overlaps? Or another way of asking the question would be, what have you learned in the hospitality space that translates well to life as a qualitative professional?
Well, a lot of what we do in research is about experience, right? A lot of it comes down to experiential type of understandings in the customer journey. So I learned a lot initially about customer experience in hospitality. Again, I was in sales out of college, and prior to that, I was a hostess in one of the hotel restaurants. I worked for the Hotel Sofitel, and I also was the hotel operator for the Hotel Sofitel. Back then, they called us PBX operators because we, had to manage the whole, one ringy dingy, two ringy dingy type of systems. And we were programming wake up calls for people who needed wake up calls. And it was in the voice of the pastry chef that was waking you up in the morning. It was all, auto programmed. But anyway, so it really was really just from the standpoint of understanding of the customer experience, which I feel like that's what it comes down to, in so much of the market research that we do. So it really gave me a broader understanding of business, and what drives customer loyalty, perceptions, brand loyalty, et cetera. And then I got into healthcare, and people say, "How did you become a healthcare marketer?" And I said, "Trust me, you don't wake up one morning and say, I think I want to be a healthcare marketer." And I've heard that with market researchers that a lot of people say that too. I didn't wake up one day and say, I want to be a market researcher or a moderator. You kind of just fall into it. And that's how it happened. That's my story.
That's your story, and you're sticking to it. Now, that's a
I
Jimmy
am.
Buffett song I just quoted, but a song that you inadvertently mentioned would be Operator by Jim Croce.
Well, look at that. And only you would pick up on that. because you're Mike.
Well, that's what I do. That's what I do. Laura, as we wrap up, I want to let our audience know, and I want you to let our audience know. I'm going to ask you. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to be more polite about it. Laura, will you please share with our audience how they can find more about you and the Desperate for a Diagnosis podcast?
Well, I am certainly on LinkedIn, of course. And with regard to podcast, I do have a podcast website. That was a whole nother thing, trying to figure out podcast website and how that whole thing works. But it's www.desperateforadiagnosis.com, or I could be reached at Laura Marie at desperateforadiagnosis.com if anyone's interested in asking any questions, or if you have a story, I'd love to hear your story as well.
Well, we will put all of your contact information there in our show notes so people can easily just tap on whatever podcast listening service they're using and see how they can get in touch with you. And I will share with our audience that if you like this interview, please like, rate, and review it on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcast. And please, if you want to see more or hear more of our QRCA podcast, go to qrcaviews.org and click on the podcast tab. Laura, thank you so much for dropping by Conversations in Depth and letting us reveal your story.
It was a pleasure, Mike, as always, Mr. Carlon.